Welcome back to the Five State Sunrise. I'm Marky Billson, and I'm with one of my favorite people to talk to. His name is Guy Waldron. He is probably always going to be best remembered as the creator of the Dukes of Hazzard. But before then, he wrote for Norman Lear, who passed away last week at the age of 101. Norman Lear was probably as influential on modern American pop culture as anyone you can name. And so here to talk about Norman Lear is Guy Waldron. And I wanted to ask, the first question is, how did you get to start to write for Norman Lear, writing on One Day at a Time?
Well, it was kind of strange. I was living in Atlanta, Georgia, and my agent was in California, and he said, I have a client, Bonnie Franklin, and she has a new series. Norman Lear has done a pilot, and I want you to take a look at it. So he sent me the pilot, and I really was drawn to it, and so instead of just drawing an outline, I wrote an entire script and sent it back to him. And he said, you normally just do an outline. He says, okay. All right, and I'll try and get it to Norman. Well, a month went by, I hadn't heard anything. I get a call, and he says, Norman read your script, and he really liked it, and he wants to put you on staff. And I told him that might be a problem since you're in Atlanta, Georgia. And I said, that won't be a problem. So Monday, I flew out, and I was in a meeting with Norman Lear, at that time the most powerful guy in television. And incredibly, here I am, a nobody writer at my age. I was 45. By that time, all of the writers in California were retiring, and here I am starting out with Norman and this oldest writer that he had, and he treated me just as if I was a pro writer, just as on top of the world, just like he was, and he treated everyone that way. That was a quality that Norman had. When he was with you, if you were a writer, as far as he was concerned, you were as good a writer as he was. And this was a quality that he had. That's why his actors loved him. All of his actors, they saw him as a father figure. All of his writers saw him as just a great writer. And one of the things he loved most was sitting in a room of writers and just relaxing and letting go with us. He was an absolutely charming man and treated everybody with enormous respect. His cast loved him, everybody loved him, and it was just a character of his to do that, treating everybody the same way. And when I was watching all these specials on him, every one of them, we all have the same view. Nobody has a different view of Norman. So that's just a character that he had. It was wonderful.
Now, the most famous show he probably will be associated with is going to be All in the Family, which is groundbreaking television. One Day at a Time that you were on, and you told me about this, you wrote a lot of the romantic parts of One Day at a Time. Not necessarily the comedy, but if there was going to be a love interest story. I remember one episode, this goes right in with someone who would create the Dukes of Hazzard, but I believe you had Anne Romano involved with a driver who raced in the Indianapolis 500, if I recall. So I wanted to ask you just a little bit about what it was that Norman saw in you and why he added you on to the One Day at a Time staff. Did he tell you?
Yeah, what happened was when I went in there, he said, he says, your comedy writing's fine, and that's great. He says, but you do one thing that none of my other writers can do. You can write romantic scenes. Well, I had written a lot of stuff, and so I said, yeah, I'm very comfortable with that. He says, I don't have a single writer that can do a romantic scene. He says, we can do jokes, and we can make anything funny. He says, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to just put you in different shows, and you deal with the romance, and the other writers can relax, and they'll do the comedy. And I said, fine. And so he kind of spotted me that way. When they did the show All's Fair, that was a new show. It was a romantic comedy, and Bernadette Peters, who's never been on television, she was a Broadway star, she came out, and so we're breaking new ground there, and I did the love shows.
The the influence of Norman Lear, in your opinion, what do you think he brought, really, I'm going to say beyond television, but to American culture? What is your opinion there?
Well, the thing that made Norman special was that he took these shows and did the comedy, and he made each show deal with something that was relevant at the time. Nobody had done that before. And so, for example, in the Bonnie Franklin show, One Day at a Time, she was dealing with a divorced woman, living alone, raising two children, facing the problems of how does she survive? And nobody had dealt with a divorced woman doing that sort of thing. And so that was one example, and all the problems of how does she survive? She gets a job? How does she raise two daughters? And so each show was dealing with something that was important to Norman. That way he dealt with, in Maud's case, he dealt with taboo subjects like abortion. He would deal with addiction. Whatever the shows were, whatever episode you had, he wanted to know what can we introduce in there that's relevant to society now. And as a result, he ended up dealing with, like All in the Family, he dealt with everything. He dealt with racism, he dealt with prejudice, he dealt with homosexuality. I mean, all of these things. He found a way to deal with what was important in society. And so his shows were important with NAACP, the Civil Rights Movement, National Organization of Women. He supported that, was one of the first to finance and support NOW. And so he was alert and aware of things that were important to him in society. He worked them into the show and managed to make them work, because you make them laugh in terms of the audience, and then they think about what you've just said. And this was something no one had done before. And he did it so successfully that when I went with him, he had 8 shows on the air. Nobody had done that.
That's incredible that someone would have 8, especially in an era where you had 3 networks and PBS. I mean, you could possibly syndicate something on independent television, but that was unheard of in a 3-network situation.
You're right. It was absolutely unheard of. Here's one guy with 3 shows, and all of them comedies, and all of them in the very top level. I mean, they weren't just good shows. They were top-rated shows all the time they were on. And that hadn't been done. So so the first thing he'd do, for example, when he was going to do a new show, he would get all the writers in, and he got the writers first before he even cast it. And they would start writing and start working, because as far as Norman were concerned, everything was like the Bible. It began with the Word. Mm-hmm. And we start with the Word and work from there. And so as a result, he dealt with writers like, he treated them that they were all on the same level he was. Well, I wasn't. I was from nowhere. But there were other guys that he'd gone to other shows, and there were writers there had been doing comedy for all of the big shows. Jackie Gleason, Bob Hope, Red Skelton. He got all those writers and pulled them in. So having that range of people, he could cover any subject, and everybody had an opinion on it, and all of them had been professional. So that once Norman put a show on, it was operating at a totally different level than any other show that had been on.
Now, what had you done before? I mean, I know you'd done the movie Moonrunners, which eventually was retooled and became the Dukes of Hazzard. But in addition to Moonrunners, you had a few credits. You had an agent, so you had a little bit of legitimacy. What was your track record or your resume that you could go to Norman Lear with a script and then eventually get hired?
Well, what I had done, I had written a lot of I wrote and directed a lot of theater, mm-hmm. and I would do one-act plays. I did a lot of just, and so I was very well grounded in theater. So when I wrote my first play, I wrote a play, and it was a comedy, and it did very well. It even toured. It toured in the Army bases, toured all over Europe. So I had a background of writing for I did some writing for some stand-up. So my background was writing and directing. So by the time I got when I did the spec script for Norman, I had already I'd written some movies, I'd written several plays, so I had a background in both writing and directing. So when I went to Norman, I had a thorough background. Actually, I had more of a background because none of his directors had ever directed theater. They were all movie directors, and they were really good. So I had a slight advantage there. So when I went to Norman, although I was not known, I had a very good background. For example, I wrote my first script when I was in high school.
Mm-hmm.
I was 18 years old. I wrote a script. It became a pilot for a syndicated show, and this was back when the very first shows were being syndicated because I was in high school. Now, that's back shortly after the discovery of fire. I mean, we're talking about, we're talking way back. And so once I did that, I then went to college and got a degree learning how to do that. I learned how to write, and so my degree, and I had the first degree from the University of Georgia. We were the first class to ever graduate in television, first broadcast degree. And so we were the pioneers at that time. And so I had a thorough background. It's just nobody on the West Coast ever heard of me, but I had been very much involved from the very beginning and even had a degree in it.
What was the name of the pilot that you did or that became that syndicated show?
You know, the only thing I can remember was I took the title Out of the Fog. And when I say it became a syndicated show, I think it lasted. They took the pilot and then went 1 year. And, well, I didn't do anything. I just wrote it. I wrote and directed the pilot and then went off to college. And it just, it lasted no more than a year because then they brought in other writers and stuff. And it was an independent company, and nobody had ever done syndication before. So I was on the ground floor, and I mean the very ground floor when I was 18.
Well, I mean, we got to find out what that is. We'll do that at a later time, find out what the pilot and the series was and such. But one thing I wanted to ask you, Norman Lear might be very much responsible with his shows for, I don't know if this was exactly his decision, but his shows did cause what was called the rural purge about 50 years ago, where a lot of country-based TV shows, Andy Griffith or Petticoat Junction, maybe not necessarily think pieces, but very rurally based, and a lot of them successful, were taken off the air for shows like, as I mentioned, All in the Family or later Maude or things of that nature. But you kind of brought back country-based television with the Dukes of Hazzard. Have you ever thought of the irony of that?
Well, yeah. What it was based, that turned out because the country was very much divided.
Yes.
Television ratings were based upon New York City and Los Angeles, California. Those were the only two places that they took ratings. The central ratings from Chicago didn't rate that much because that's what they call flyover country. It was middle America. Well, because I had done stuff, I had just finished doing a documentary in Nashville where they had just opened the Hall of Fame for country artists. And I had just done a documentary on that, and I found out that 1 out of every 7 records worldwide was a country music record. And I thought, good Lord, that's an awfully large crowd. So as a result, I realized that Middle America was an enormous country audience. And so when I did the movie Moonrunners, it was based upon, of course, moonshine. And we did it in the South, but it was drawn from all Middle America. They jumped on it immediately, and they loved it. So as a result, I had a background, of course. When I was a kid, for example, some of the drivers that I knew were moonshine drivers because I was raised on a farm. And they were moonshine drivers, eventually went on to become what we call dirt track drivers. So my background was in that area. So I had a rural background, even though I was raised part of the time in Atlanta, part of the time in Cincinnati. But I was on the farm all the time, every summer. So I had a kind of a split role there. So I was comfortable in both areas.
I see. Okay. And so, yeah, I was always wondering, because I knew you had grown up in Kentucky, how the University of Georgia came about. But I get, going back between Kentucky and Georgia and such. Now, we're talking to Guy Waldron, who wrote for Norman Lear. What do you think the lasting legacy of Norman Lear is going to be?
Well, I think a perfect example is when they did a special on Norman the other day. Every network at the same time did the special. They all broadcast at the same time the same show because of his influence. This has never happened before. It'll never happen again because of the way television is so segmented now. His lasting influence will both be on the culture, because here was a guy who took theater or drama and comedy, took what was important and going on socially in the world, like civil rights and all of those things, and managed to work them in with comedy. If you make an audience laugh, they'll listen to anything else you say. And this is the whole premise of comedy writers. We've all known this for years. Norman made an epic industry out of that. Nobody had done it before. So his impact on the culture will be the fact that he took mass media and changed it, because all of a sudden we realized the audience will accept all of these important issues if you give it to them in the right way. And nobody ever tried this before. And Norman, because these were so important to him, he was going to work them in every show. Whatever show you had a great plot line. Okay, fine. Now, what's the issue here that we can work in that's important? And this was used on every show he did. All the writers knew, said, okay, we know we got a good plot line. Now, how do we work in here what's important? What's happening in America? What are they dealing with that we can deal with? And he used that as an enormous social, you would almost say weapon, but an enormous social effect based upon using comedy, using drama to make America aware of all these other issues. Nobody had ever done that before. Once he did it, it became the benchmark. Now, I mean, you work stuff in. If you were going to sell a show now, you would just work that in automatically.
Yeah.
Nobody's going to go back to the fact that this was started by one guy who had this vision, and he felt these issues were important and knew how to make it work, and it worked across the board. That changed, not only did he change television, he changed the thinking of everybody who worked in television. And, that's a visionary. That doesn't happen except in very rare cases.
Look, I realize that Dukes of Hazzard and All in the Family or Maude or something are very different shows. However, one theme that I do sort of see in the Dukes is the attitude of nonviolence. Boss Hogg may have been crooked, but he abhorred violence. He did not want to harm the Duke boys. He, just wanted to get them out of the way, basically. A stranger is just a friend you've never met before. That was sort of a mantra of Uncle Jesse. Was Norman Lear an influence for that to be part of your most famous TV series?
Well, not to discredit Norman, it's just we were going at an entirely different situation. We were trying to create the Southern boyhood that I had. And in order to do that, we made some rules. And the rule was, first, we have no violence on each other. If we had a fight, it was a bar fight, and then we'd get up and shake hands and go do something else. We had a rule. All the violence as such is on the machinery. We wreck cars and we tear those up, and that is the basis of our violence. We had very little gunfire, very seldom, and we never used fake blood. I don't use a pint the entire 7 years because we'd have a fight, in effect. It was totally fake. You have a bar fight, and then when they get up, it's over. Nobody's trying to kill anyone, and in fact, all of these people who were theoretical enemies, like Boss Hogg and Sheriff Roscoe, they also were people that they knew, they grew up with, and so they might be on the opposite side, but occasionally you'd side with them when an outsider would come in and try to cause trouble to the town. And so we had this kind of attitude. For example, it never rains in Hazzard County. We never had any rain shows. It's seldom night. We had very few night shoots. The point is, everything happens, it's bright, it's sunny, and it's fun. We have fun. We have comedy going all the time. When we sold the idea to the network, there had never been a 1-hour show that had comedy in it. Comedy was always reserved for sitcoms. And we said, well, in Dukes, we're going to be funny the whole time they're on. And so they said, well, I don't know if that'll work. I said, but we tried it, and the audience loved it. They didn't have any problem with it at all. So we were operating, trying to create our own world, which it turns out Norman Lear is in effect doing the same thing, and he was dealing with the same thing, nonviolence, civil rights, this sort of thing. We dealt with civil rights in an interesting way. For example, the sheriff in the next county over was black, and we had an enormous amount of fun with that the first time they met him. So we used that kind of a racial thing to have fun with. Also, at the time Dukes was on the air, we were hiring more black actors and extras than any other show. When we had people come in from the outside, one or two of the villains was played by a black guy. This gave a lot of black actors work, and so we had a thing going within Dukes that was doing in effect the same thing Norman was. We're all dealing with the same problems, we're just doing them in a different way. But and so that's why, not to discredit Norman in any way. Mm-hmm. Norman changed the world. I don't know how much change we made, but we had a lot of fun.
I was remembering the black sheriff, Don Pedro Coley, playing Sheriff Little. He was actually a friend of mine. And very little known fact, a one-time Olympic athlete, 1960s Rome Olympics, through the shot put. Finishing this up with Guy Waldron, who wrote for Norman Lear. We're remembering Norman Lear here on the 5-State Sunrise. You told me about a book you're writing. You're still very active. It's a thriller. Let us know about this, and when is it going to hit the stores and Amazon?
Well, it's going to hit the stores on Amazon in May. The book is titled Twist of Time, and it's a thriller. And I had a lot of fun doing that because there is one strange thing in it. One of the twists in it actually occurred to me when I was in counterintelligence in Germany. I had a twist occur to me, and I then put it in the book because they're going along, all of a sudden there's this plot twist, and it's an enormous twist, but it had actually happened in my life, and so I just put it in there. So it's a book that I've gotten very good response so far. It's a lot of fun. It's a thriller, but it has some other things to say in it, and so I hope I'll send you a copy, and I hope you like it. And if you like it, you can tell folks.
Well, you got a deal there, but I got to ask you, I know you were in the military, but counterintelligence in Germany? What was that role in your life? How did you get that gig?
Well, this was long before I went to Hollywood. When I was in the military, they put me in counterintelligence, and we were totally operating, in effect, separately. And my particular desk, I was on the KGB desk, specializing, in my particular case, I was specializing in interrogations. But at the time, we had other things going on, of course, in dealing with the communists. And one of the events that happened to me I don't want to talk about it because it would be a spoiler, but one of the events happened all of a sudden was, what? And so I was able later on to take this and use it as a twist in the novel. So when in the thriller, when this occurred, it had actually happened to me, and when it happened, it just stopped the clocks. We all said, what? And so that's in there, and it's real. It had happened to me.
See, folks, you didn't know this about the Dukes of Hazzard. You had Norman Lear, you had counterintelligence with Germany, and, I mean, even Sorrel Book, I believe, in the Korean War worked in counterintelligence for the United States. He would go on to play Boss Hogg, of course. But your guy, Waldron, wrote for Norman Lear. We're remembering him here today on the 5-State Sunrise. Back after this.